Are you trying to set up factories using FactoryBot for your test suite? Then stick around and find out how. I'm Thomas with Brain Trust Digital. I'm a full stack developer obsessed with learning. If you're interested in learning about full stack web development, please consider subscribing below. In this AWS Rails tutorial, we're going to walk through the entire process of installing FactoryBot. FactoryBot is a drop-in replacement for fixtures that has a lot of niceties built in. I don't want to go into too much detail in the intro. Let's just get right into the video and walk through how to install FactoryBot into your Ruby on Rails application. The first thing we're going to do here is navigate to rubygems.org. Next, in the search bar, we can search for the FactoryBot Rails gem and hit enter. Here you can see the gem we are looking for. In our case, at time of recording, this is version 6.1.0. So we'll go ahead and click that title, and then scroll down a little bit and click through to the homepage to get to the gem's GitHub repository. From here, we're going to scroll down and look for the installation instructions. As you can see, just like our spec Rails, this gem will only be added for development and testing. So here we can grab this line since we already know we have a development and test group in our gem file. Flipping back over to Sublime Text and opening our gem file, we can scroll down to that development and test group. Here we'll paste our gem below the RSpec Rails gem, then we're going to flip to the terminal to install. Bundle install will go out and fetch the gem for us, as well as any necessary dependencies. Next, if we flip back over to the browser, we can look at how to configure FactoryBot Rails for our application. Just below the gem block, you can see the link to the configuration section. So if we click that link now, this walks through how to configure depending on your test suite. In our specific case, we use RSpec, but obviously you're going to want to follow the specific configuration for your particular test suite. Here you can see there are two different RSpec configurations. In our case, we are using Rails, so we can go ahead and copy this top block here. Above, you can see we're going to want to place this file in spec support, and then we're going to want to name it factory_bot.rb, and then we'll have to make sure we require that in our Rails helper. So in our Rails app, under our spec folder, we're going to create a new folder for support. As the documentation implied, inside this folder, we'll click new file to create that FactoryBot file. We'll go ahead and save this file, then paste our code. As mentioned, we still need to require this file so that it can be used in our test suite, and we need to do so in our Rails helper. So here in our Rails helper, underneath where we require our spec Rails, we're going to go ahead and enter down a few more times and paste a line of code. Instead of requiring the specific file that we just created, factory_bot.rb, we're providing a more flexible or future forward scenario where all support files can go in this support folder. We wouldn't want to have to come back here and continue to require those individually. So instead, we're now requiring everything in the spec support folder. Next, you can see the double asterisk there is any level of nested folders inside of this support folder. And then finally, we're looking for anything that ends in a .rb. For each file found, that will be required in this Rails helper. So now that we've got FactoryBot installed and we've got the syntax helpers included in our test suite, we need to go ahead and create our first factory. To create our first factory, we're going to flip over to the terminal, and then we're going to use the FactoryBot generation commands. In this case, that's Rails G FactoryBot model, and then the factory that we want to create. In this case, it's going to be user. So if we flip back over to Sublime Text, you can see that created the factories folder for us, as well as the users.rb user factory. Here within the user factory boilerplate, you're going to pass in keys that align to database columns on your model, as well as the values you'd like to use whenever you need a user instance. In our case, we're going to set our defaults to the most infamous programmer of the last 30 years. The one difference here is that we're going to pass in false for the value of admin, but obviously he was an admin. Now that we've got our factory created, we can open up our user spec created in our previous RSpec tutorial to see how we would use this new factory. On line 5, the setup, where we're setting a user equal to the creation of a new user, is where our factory would come into play. So if we comment this code out, but leave it there for reference and then enter down on a new line, we can translate the syntax to FactoryBot syntax. So to do so, we're going to again use our user variable. I'm going to set that equal to create, which is a new method provided to us by FactoryBot, and then a symbol of the factory. In this case, it's user. Now that we're using FactoryBot, this will actually hit all associations and callbacks, as well as validations. You can override values by passing in comma-separated keys and values to your factory. So in our case, we can pass in first name of Chipper, last name of Rowe. He's the goodest boy. All other defaults set in the user's factory, for example, the admin value of false, will be used since they're not overridden. One caveat to mention here, if we flipped over to the terminal and tried to run our suite, we would get an error. We'd be subject to all of the validations required by devise users. The instance that we need does not have to be saved to the database. So in this case, we can change our create call to a build call. This is one of the nice features of using something like FactoryBot and is a subtle optimization. All we care about is that if we had a user object with a first name and a last name, that the full name method runs correctly. We don't actually care that this object passed validations and that this is in fact a valid devise user. Since the concern of our test is just the full name method, we can get away with using build here and not have to pay the cost of actually storing this data to the database and therefore running through all of Rails' validations. I understand some of you may want to test methods that rely on a user creation. So I'll circle back at the end of this video to update the user's factory to create a valid devise user. So we can delete the line above and then go to the terminal. To run our suite again, we'll run our spec, and there you have it, our suite passes. Just to prove things are working, let's go ahead and cut the last name for a minute and then save and rerun the spec. Here you'll see our expectation versus what we actually got. Since we did not pass in a last name value to override the defaults, we instead just received the default last name, yielding a value that was different than our expectation block below. Flip back over and paste back in or undo that change, then ensure our test suite passes once again. You can see everything is working as we expect. Now we've successfully implemented our spec with FactoryBot factories. Next, let's create a factory for our videos model. If we flip over to the terminal and run that same FactoryBot generator command, this time for videos, we can go ahead and create our video factory. Here you can see the videos.rb file has been added to the factories folder. The videos model, in our case, has a title, a YouTube ID, and a position value. In this case, the title and YouTube ID are just gonna be strings as with the previous factory. So we'll just paste those in. Next is position. Position, in our case, is an integer value. So we could just go ahead and place an integer in the curly braces. As we continue to use this video factory, we would constantly be creating video instances with the exact same position. Everyone would come out as 1. You could override this at time of creation, or we could place a sensible default. That's where sequences come in. Instead, let's just delete the value, leaving the key, and wrap this in a sequence. A FactoryBot sequence is just an increasing count. The first video to be created via this factory will have the position of 1, and the next 2, the next 3, and so on. This is a more accurate representation to the type of data we'd expect in position anyways. So this works out quite nicely. Now that we've got videos, let's go ahead and create a factory for our categories. Flipping back over to the terminal, we can again run the generator command, this time with category, to create the base category factory with the FactoryBot boilerplate code. In the case of categories, we simply want to populate a name column. This is pretty straightforward, so we could just populate as always. The database column is name, and then just pass in a string value, category. As you can see, if we generated several categories, this would get a little bit confusing. We could have 10 or 12 category factory instances that are all the identical name. That doesn't really help us much. As you've just learned, we can use sequence to create simple dynamic values, as just demonstrated with position. In this case, we don't want categories with the names simply as 1, 2, 3. I wanted to demonstrate that you can actually pass in a block to sequence to create these dynamic values. Here we'll call our variable n, and then after category, we're just going to interpolate that same number. So now we'll get category 1, category 2, category 3, and so on as we continue to create category instances from this factory. Next, let's go ahead and talk about traits. To do so, let's create a role factory. Flipping over to the terminal, Running that same command for role. Now we have our roles factory. Flipping back over to Sublime Text and opening our new roles file, you can again see the boilerplate as you'd expect. In a previous video, we walked through the process of adding roles to our users, and in that video, we created 3 roles: default, contributor, and moderator. Given that one of our roles is named default, it makes sense to set these as the values for our initial role factory. As you can see, our factory has a name and a code, which lines up with our role model. Now let's add some traits. Traits allow you to group attributes and then apply them to factories. So in this case, I'm going to paste in a couple of traits. These traits represent the values associated with the 2 other types of roles previously mentioned, contributor and moderator. These are nested in the role factory. And what this basically says is that in these cases, we would want a role instance created, but instead of using default, if we selected contributor, for example, the code and name would be set as follows: contributor and the capital presentation value of contributor. There's also the concept of factories within factories. If we enter down a few more times, we can create nested factories. In this case, we're creating a contributor role factory that just uses the contributor trait from the role factory, repeating this process and applying to moderator. This way, we can just call the moderator role factory, and we'll get all of the traits that we need assigned. It's important to note this is just scratching the surface with traits. This array could contain several traits, and this factory would be the combination of all of those traits shoved into the role factory. So it's a really powerful tool. Next, let's circle back to our user factory and make a few updates. The first thing you may notice is that the admin value looks a lot like something we could pull out as a trait. The first thing to note here is, from a database perspective, our admin boolean is set to false by default. You're going to want to confirm that in your schema. Here you can see our admin boolean has a default to false. So this was pasted in here more for demonstration purposes, but it's not actually required. So we can go ahead and delete that. Instead, let's add an admin trait value. This gives us the ability to create an instance of either a regular user or an admin user. To do so, in our specs, we would call create or build commands, user, and then pass in the trait of admin. Another change we'd like to make here is to add a confirmed add column. As you can see in our schema, this is on our database and present because we're using the confirmable module of devise. So if we flip back over to our users factory, then paste in the code, we're going to say our confirmed at is 1.day ago. Since this value is a date time, this will just pass in the date and time of a day ago. Since there is a value present here, devise will view this as a confirmed user. Once setting our default users to be confirmed, it may make sense for testing purposes to have the ability to create an unconfirmed user. We do so via a trait once again. Here, just setting this value to nil. With a blank value in this column, devise will assume this user has not yet confirmed. The next thing you're going to need to know when creating factories are how to handle associations. In our case, a user belongs to a role. In factory syntax, we can just pass the word role. The reason we're able to do this is because we're following convention here. We have a role factory, and the relationship is also called role. A user belongs to a role. So FactorBot is smart enough to know that this association will also use that factory. This is referred to as implicit definition of roles. We could also say association role if we wanted to explicitly note this as an association. I'm going to go back to the implicit definition, as this is clear enough in my case, but choose whatever works best for you. I'm going to add a couple more traits. Here we have the moderator role and the contributor role that I've wrapped in traits. Just like admin, more of a convenience so we can create users of different roles very easily. In this case, though, we're associating implicit association data as opposed to just a Boolean value. Again, you may want to group some of these various traits into nested factories as previously mentioned. Here we're creating an admin user, which has the trait of admin and moderator. So the factory will start with the base user, substitute the moderator role out for the default role, and then add the admin value of true. All of the various traits we want on our admin. You can see similar examples for creating a contributor user or an unconfirmed user. This is still only just scratching the surface of FactoryBot, but I thought it'd be a nice primer to get you started. The documentation for FactoryBot is fantastic, so you're going to want to check that out if you really want to take a deep dive and use all of the various features that FactoryBot allows for. So now that we've created some base factories, let's flip it back over to the terminal, and we're going to run our test suite again. We do so with our spec. This is going to run our entire test suite, which just consists of one test. And as you can see, it's passed with 0 failures. Now let's circle back and see how we'd update this factory so that we could use a create call. In other words, ensure we can create a valid devise user. One quick note I wanted to point out before we get started is that if you flip over to the browser, you can see that Devise provides some test helpers. If you're looking to create valid controller or integration specs, you're going to want to reference this section of the Devise documentation. In our case, we're just creating a simple model spec, but I want to be sure to point that out. So the first step here would be to switch this to a create. We'll go ahead and save, flip over to the console, and see how this fails. When we rerun the spec, we can see that we failed validations for email and password being blank. If we flip back over to Sublime Text and then open our user's factory, you can see the attributes we've defined on our user model. So now let's account for that blank email and password. Here, just below confirmed at, we'll add a few more values. Email and password. If we flip back over to the terminal and run our specs, as you can see, our test suite is passing, which proves we can create a valid devise user that was persisted to the database. Again, you only want to use the FactoryBot create command if you need the data to persist. In our case, since we do not need this data to persist, we're going to go ahead and flip back over to the build command. Here in our user spec, we can just replace create with build. This allows us to save all of the costs associated with running Rails validations, all callbacks, and the time to persist this to the database. Over time, with a large test suite, these little optimizations can really add up. Flipping back over to the terminal one more time, we can ensure our spec suite still passes. And there you have it. I just noticed there's one small error that I wanted to correct in our moderator and contributor traits. Here, we can't use an implicit association. I'll go ahead and update the user spec to show how this will fail, given the current setup. So if we flip over to the user spec and instead change this to an admin underscore user, flipping back to the user factory, you can see our admin user has the traits admin and moderator. Moderator is an implicit definition to the role association and moderator role factory. If we flip over to the terminal and rerun the spec, you can see this fails. Undefined moderator role equals. Since this name differs from the association, FactoryBot can't infer what we want here. In this case, we need to use the explicit association. So if we flip back over here under moderator role, we need to type in the association name, which is role. Then we're going to tell FactoryBot that this is a factory called moderator role, the name of the factory in the role factories file. We flip back over to the terminal and rerun the spec. You can see that passes. We can copy that and make the same changes for our contributor factory, and then flip over to our user spec to also test out this factory and ensure everything is functioning as we expect. Now that we've got that fixed, I'm going to go ahead and reset our user spec to a regular user. I was only changing that for testing purposes. This was just a slight mistake I wanted to correct really quickly. I just wanted to point out that there are scenarios like this where you may need to use the explicit association. In this case, since moderator role means nothing to our Rails app, we need to tell FactoryBot this is actually just a FactoryBot factory that we want to use for the roles association. So while I won't be test driving all new features, I would like to start to add this into our process to give a more realistic example of what the full development process may look like for a specific feature as we create them. Typically at this point is when I realized I should have created a branch at the beginning of the feature. So let's go ahead and do that now. We'll do so with git checkout -b. In this case, we're going to call this branch FactoryBot. Now that we're switched to our new branch, let's go ahead and add our code with git add dot. We can confirm our code is staged with git status. Now that our code is staged, let's go ahead and create a commit with a message with git commit -m. Then we can run get push to push our branch up to our remote repository, GitHub. If you're still learning Git or GitHub, I have a tutorial you can reference that I'll link in the card as well as the description below. Now is typically when you'd want to create a pull request in GitHub and then go ahead and request a review of your code. In our case, to keep things moving forward, I'm just going to merge my branch. To do so, we'll run a get checkout master to get back onto our, spelled correctly, to get back onto our main branch. Then we will run a get merge and factory bot, the name of our feature branch. Finally, we'll run get push to push this new merged branch up to our main branch in GitHub. So from a high level perspective, you're typically going to want to create your feature branch, add your code, run your test suite to ensure you didn't unintentionally break anything, and then commit your code for review and merge into the main branch and deploy. In our case, there's no real change here for production since this is only test code that we've written here, so we're not going to be deploying. So I hope you found this useful. Please leave any questions, comments, or tutorial requests in the comment section below. If you found this video useful, please give it a like, or if you'd consider sharing it with a friend who you think may find this interesting, I'd really appreciate it. And with that, I'll catch you in the next AWS Rails tutorial.